One of the most confusing things about being in a relationship with a narcissist is that somehow everything becomes your fault. No matter what happens, no matter how small the situation is, no matter who actually caused the problem, somehow the blame always finds its way back to you. And after a while, you begin asking yourself a painful question. How did I become the problem in my own relationship? But here's something many survivors only realize later. The blame was never really about you. It was about protecting something the narcissist will do almost anything to defend. Their image. If you've experienced this, you probably remember the confusion it created. At first, the arguments didn't make sense. You tried explaining your perspective. You tried staying calm. You tried resolving the conflict. But somehow the conversation kept shifting. What started as a discussion about their behavior suddenly became a discussion about yours. You were told you were too sensitive, too emotional, too demanding, too critical, too difficult. And after hearing those messages repeatedly, something subtle began happening inside you. You started questioning yourself. Blame shifting is a very common pattern in narcissistic relationships because accepting responsibility requires something narcissistic personalities often struggle with: vulnerability. Admitting mistakes means acknowledging imperfection. It means recognizing that their actions may have hurt someone. And for many narcissistic personalities, that kind of self-reflection feels threatening to their self-image. So instead of facing that discomfort, they redirect the responsibility. They shift the focus. They move the conversation away from their actions and toward your reaction. Here's the part most people don't understand. Blame shifting is not just about avoiding responsibility. It also creates emotional confusion. When someone consistently redirects blame, the conversation becomes disorienting. You begin this discussion believing you're addressing one issue. But by the end of the conversation, you're apologizing for something completely different. And this confusion slowly reshapes how you see the relationship. Because over time, you begin assuming responsibility for problems you didn't create. Think about how exhausting that dynamic can become. Every disagreement turns into self-defense. Every concern becomes an argument about your character. Every emotional reaction becomes proof that you are the problem. And after enough time, you may start walking into conversations already prepared to apologize. Not because you did something wrong, but because you want peace. And this is why it hurts so much. Because relationships are supposed to be spaces of emotional safety. Places where both people can acknowledge mistakes. Where growth is possible, where accountability strengthens the connection. But blame shifting destroys that balance because one person becomes responsible for everything, while the other becomes responsible for nothing. And that imbalance slowly erodes your confidence. Maybe you remember moments when you started doubting your own memory. You remember the conversation clearly, but they insisted it happened differently. You remembered their words, but they claimed you misunderstood. You remembered how something made you feel, but they told you your reaction was irrational. And slowly, reality itself began to feel uncertain. But something even more confusing often happens in relationships like this, because the blame doesn't always arrive in obvious ways. Sometimes it appears subtly, quietly, almost invisibly. It might start with small comments, a sigh when you express a feeling, a subtle remark suggesting you're overreacting, a suggestion that you misunderstood what they meant. At first, these moments seem small, maybe even harmless, but over time they start forming a pattern. Every time you try to express something that hurt you, the focus slowly shifts away from your feelings and toward your reaction. Suddenly, the conversation isn't about what happened. It's about how you responded to it. You become too emotional, too dramatic, too sensitive, And when this pattern repeats long enough, something very powerful begins to happen. You start filtering your own emotions. Before expressing something that bothers you, you pause. You think carefully. You wonder if speaking up will create conflict. You begin asking yourself questions like, is this worth bringing up? Am I overreacting? Maybe it's not that serious. And slowly, something important begins disappearing from the relationship, your voice. But here's the part most people don't understand. This shift doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, almost invisibly, which is why so many survivors later look back and ask themselves, how did I lose so much confidence in my own feelings? The answer is often hidden inside hundreds of small moments. Moments where your emotions were dismissed, your concerns were redirected, your perspective was questioned, and every one of those moments planted a small seed of doubt. Over time, those seeds grow, until one day you find yourself apologizing for things that never required an apology. You start explaining yourself more, justifying your feelings, trying to prove that your perspective makes sense. But here's something important to understand. Healthy relationships do not require you to defend your reality. They allow space for both people to express emotions. They allow disagreements without turning them into character attacks. They allow accountability without turning it into blame. But when blame shifting becomes a pattern, the emotional environment changes. Instead of feeling safe to express yourself, you begin feeling responsible for managing the other person's reactions. And that responsibility can become incredibly exhausting, because no matter how carefully you communicate, the outcome often stays the same. The conversation circles back, and somehow, once again, the blame lands on you. But here's something many survivors only realize after leaving the relationship. The constant blame was never about discovering the truth. It was about maintaining control of the narrative. Because when someone controls the narrative of a relationship, they control how events are interpreted. They control who appears responsible. And they control who appears at fault. But the moment you begin recognizing this pattern, something important begins shifting inside you. Instead of automatically accepting the blame, you begin questioning the dynamic itself. You begin asking a different question, not what did I do wrong, but why does every conversation end with me taking responsibility for everything? And that question can become incredibly powerful because it opens the door to clarity. Clarity about the dynamic, clarity about the manipulation, clarity about the emotional patterns that once kept you trapped in confusion. And once clarity begins growing, the blame slowly starts losing its power. This pattern is closely connected to something called gaslighting. Gaslighting occurs when someone repeatedly challenges another person's perception of reality. Not always in obvious ways, sometimes in subtle ways, small contradictions, dismissed feelings, rewritten conversations. Over time, this can create deep emotional confusion. Because when your perception is constantly questioned, self-trust begins to weaken. But here's something important many survivors eventually realize. The constant blame was never evidence that you were the problem. It was evidence that the relationship lacked accountability. Healthy relationships involve shared responsibility. Both people acknowledge mistakes. Both people listen. Both people grow. But when blame only moves in one direction, it stops being a relationship. It becomes emotional control. Understanding this can become incredibly freeing, because once you recognize the pattern, you stop internalizing every accusation. You stop believing every criticism defines you. You begin separating their narrative from your reality. And slowly, something powerful begins returning. Self-trust. The ability to trust your perception again. the ability to recognize manipulation, the ability to protect your emotional boundaries. Healing from narcissistic relationships often begins with rebuilding your sense of self, because blame shifting can leave deep emotional marks. You may have spent months or even years believing you were the difficult one, the emotional one, the complicated one. But clarity changes that story. You begin remembering the moments when your concerns were valid, the times your feelings were dismissed, the patterns you once tried to ignore. And with that clarity, your confidence slowly begins to return. If someone constantly blamed you for everything, remember this: taking responsibility for your own action is healthy, but carrying responsibility for someone else's behavior is not. Healthy love does not require you to shrink yourself. It does not require you to question your reality, and it never requires you to accept blame just to keep the peace. The more clearly you see the pattern, the less power it has over you. If this video helped you understand something about your experience, consider subscribing to the channel. Here we talk openly about narcissistic relationships, trauma bonds, and emotional recovery. Because understanding what happened to you is the first step toward reclaiming your life. And remember, you survived the relationship. Here, we help you survive it too. And if you've ever asked yourself another question, was my relationship actually narcissistic? Or was I imagining things? The next video on this channel explores the clearest signs you are in a narcissistic relationship. And once you recognize those signs, even more pieces of your experience will begin to make sense.